Welcome to the Jill on Money Coronavirus Market Update. It is Saturday, August 1st. And this weekend, we've got a great interview with a friend of mine. His name is Dane Holmes. I met him a long time ago. We were on a board together, and his career has been so fascinating. He is an HR professional, if you can believe it. Yes, there are normal people who go into that side of the business. They tend to be wonderful people who we don't really respect when everything's just poking around and going as is. And then when really crazy issues flare up or where we see discrepancies in the workplace, then we need them. So Dane worked at Goldman Sachs for many years and now has gone to help found a company called Eskalera. So we're going to talk about his effort to improve diversity and inclusion by starting this company and his own experience as well. So here's my interview with Dane Holmes. So, Dane, full disclosure, Dane and I serve on the board of a nonprofit together. That's how I know you. But you also were a very early in this idea that you have to actually care about the people in an organization. So, can you tell us a little bit about, before we talk about the new company, tell us a little bit about you and your career? Because when I first met you, you were working at a place called Goldman Sachs. So, what's the story of Dane Holmes? What's the origin story?
Sure, I'll try and give you a brief one. So just a little bit of background. My background is, my dad is black, my mom is white. I grew up down in Atlanta, and when I was young, I wanted to be an architect. And so I ended up going to New York City in large case because I said it was the first place I'd ever been where I didn't really feel my race. I just felt like people wanted me to get out of the way because they were on their way somewhere, but that felt great. So as I stared up at these giant buildings, but I got my degree in architecture, but after doing an internship, thought this might not be the career path that I wanted. So I ended up going to Wall Street really just because largely I was in New York. And I fell in love with it for really two reasons. One, the analytical rigor that was part of it. And two, because it really was a industry that required both EQ, dealing with people, as well as IQ. And I guess that was the beginning of me realizing that what I really enjoyed about work, what I thought really made the difference or was a differentiator was people and wanting to work with people, invest in people, build people, and have organizations that were people-centric. So that kind of drove my career for a long time.
When you hear about this, when you hear people person or HR, there have been times in the past where people kind of roll their eyes like, oh, HR. So can you talk a little bit about how the industry itself evolved, like the idea of managing people and what you found in your career?
Yeah, so there's a lot of cycles and trends around that are actually pretty fascinating. I think it's important to remember that HR largely grew, if you go way back, it grew out of something called personnel. And if you think about personnel, even in just the language around it, it was more about the process of hiring people, the process of having to pay them. And it had certainly had an overtone to it that was much more about managing the risk as opposed to managing the upside. What I think is that there's just been this long evolution within the profession, within people's perspectives of how they think about it, to the point where, the phrase that you often use are people are our most important asset. But this journey to fulfill that comment, to make it an actuality, that when you say people are our most valuable asset, you actually treat it as your most valuable asset. And I think that's a journey that the industry is still on. The one thing that I can say about HR professionals is they care deeply, deeply about their work. They're passion-based people, and they care deeply about making sure people can reach their potential. So from that perspective, I've seen that the whole time.
That's kind of a cool way to actually think about it. I think that the interesting part of this is that, you also, as a mixed race person, come to this whole expression around where we are today in the national conversation with a lot of experience. Was it surprising to you? I know you'd left Goldman Sachs by the time this year's events occurred, but has it been surprising to you to hear the corporate response to the killings, the marches? Like, what is it that's sort of like the upside and downside of this?
I mean, I think on one level, it shouldn't be surprising, and we can certainly talk a lot about all of the breadcrumbs that would lead you to the view that this should have been, and it made sense that this was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. As far as, corporate America's response, I think that's a journey that they're still on. Certainly, I think it's valuable that they took some of the actions that they did, which were, letters of support, writing checks to philanthropies, et cetera. But to be frank, those are the pretty easy steps to take. The much harder step will be looking in the mirror, looking at your own organization and your own processes, and see where you've underdelivered or underperformed on attaining that goal of being a meritocracy, attaining that goal of allowing people to bring their whole selves to work. And that is a major work in progress, I think, for corporate America, because while it's been something that, a lot of people have talked about for a long time, I think there's very few organizations who've made it a top priority. And I think there's very few organizations who've probably invested the amount of time and money required to make the change that they need to make at this stage. So they're in early innings of their journey.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference, the carrot and the stick approach? Because obviously, for years, certainly in financial services and throughout corporate America, everyone's, oh, we've got to do better. We really do, and it's really, we'd like you to do this, or we'd like you to be on this committee, or we want to do that, and yet, you know what? I keep thinking to myself, if we said to everyone, let's just use the financial services industry, if we said your bonus is predicated on whether your team reflects the population base or not, people would figure out how to hire more Black and brown people and women.
I think that that's true on one level. I think there is a bit of a complexity with it. The part that's true is that, I definitely am fully in the camp, which is in part why we've created the inclusion index at Eskalera, that you can't change what you don't measure. And so platitudes and speeches without, hardcore measurement, and that measurement isn't just in your performance, but that's measurement applied to how you're compensated, et cetera, is a really big part of the formula, and one that's been missing. And we all know, I mean, since I was little, I was growing up, my parents told me, you do that, there's going to be consequences. And we all know that when there's real consequences, you have real behavior change. So I believe in both of those. The one thing that I will say that I believe in deeply as well is a concept of strength-based learning. And that while it's great to have the stick, we should really be having this conversation around how having supporting diversity and inclusion will make you a better organization, how it aligns you more with being a meritocracy, how it is correlated more to being a high performer. When you think about our inclusion index, which has 4 components of it, it has trust, voice, belonging, and growth mindset. All 4 of those characters, which are core from our view of an inclusive environment, are also core with being a high performance environment. I think we have to talk about what's to be gained, not just maybe what has been lost in the process, and that's a mind shift for folks.
All right, so let's talk about the new place, which is called Eskalera, which I kind
Yeah,
of want to make it Italian, but I don't know what does Eskalera mean.
it's a different language. It's Spanish for elevate. So for us, it's we have the tagline that we want to engage, empower, and elevate, and that is really our goal. That through this work, we're not just elevating women and brown people and people of different sexual orientation. We're elevating organizations and cultures.
I'm on the website, began as a passion project for co-founder Tom Chavez, who is the brother of your former colleague Marty Chavez, right?
Correct. That's correct.
What got you involved in this? Why leave Goldman Sachs? You are making piles of money. Are you insane? Why would you leave?
Yeah, so I mean, I think life is all about fulfilling different passions and variety. As corny as it sounds, I believe a diverse life is also a well-lived life. And one thing that was always true, and maybe this is the part of my early dreams of being an architect that played through. I love building things. Most of my career that I spent at Goldman Sachs, I was either building or renovating something within the organization. And, I got to the stage in my life where, sitting there as the head of HR at Goldman Sachs, where I saw this giant problem of this lack of the leveraging of data in solving the problems that most CHROs face. I also saw that a lot of the technology that was being used wasn't really geared around the employee, wasn't truly putting the employee at the center. And I felt like that was a big mistake. So I had a choice in my mind. I could stay at Goldman Sachs, a firm, that I love, that's been great to me, and try and change it with that organization, or I could build a company that's going to change it for multiple. And I just found myself attracted to the latter. And so thus the change, just the change started.
You've got a bunch of data points on here about how companies that are more diverse are, basically going to make more money, hit financial goals. All of that being said, what has been the barrier? I mean, because we've always heard this. We've heard this about like, oh, if you have more women on boards, companies perform better. And yet there are not as many women on board. So what is this wall that is up in corporate America?
There's a bunch of challenges. First and foremost, in the busy demands that any organization is facing, I don't think you can drive any sort of systemic change. And let's just be clear, this is about systemic change. This is not about tweaking things. This is, overhauling the whole system. If it's not a top, one or two priority and it's not heavily invested in over time, you're not going to get that change. So, one just pure problem has been the lack of prioritization and the lack of investment into the area. The other challenge of it is that obviously corporate America lives within a system, and that system supports the behavior. And so it's hard, even within your own system, to fight a broader system that's around you, which is a challenge. But the one thing that I think is the most interesting one, at least for me, in thinking about what has been challenging, it's really 2 points. One is just this idea that a lot of leaders within corporate America have no proximity really to diversity. It's not how they spend their time. It's not who they're invested with. I've had a bunch of conversation with leaders of mine who are white men who are like, hey, Dane, I want to do more. I want to figure this out more. And, I've often said a pretty simple phrase. I said, well, the Black population, to use that example, is 13% of the population. Are you devoting 13% of your time, energy, and money with that population? And if you're not, you don't have proximity to it. And, it's been, a cause for reflection in a lot of the conversations that I've had. So I think proximity is a big one. The last one is the classic ego challenge, which, is always a problem whenever human beings are messing up. A part of it has to do with ego. When you say to somebody that the system isn't fair or that you benefit from privilege, the challenge is that people's immediate response is some version of, I worked hard to get where I was. You don't know what I had to go through. You don't know where I came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've heard this mantra before. But there's this lack of acknowledgement that there's 3 things that drive anybody's success, talent, luck, and effort. And the biggest of those is always luck. And privilege is about making you more lucky. And it doesn't mean that you didn't work hard, and it doesn't negate that you have talent. But the fact that the most important thing in life is luck, and that privilege is a massive advantage in the category of luck, people struggle with that because it goes against their own identity of like, I earned this, I made this, I created this.
Okay, that was part 1 of the interview with Dane Holmes. Tomorrow in that episode, we're going to really focus on pay inequality, whether it's racial or gender, and how Eskalera is trying to figure out a way to help companies make that a more equitable situation. As always, we so appreciate you sending us questions. Our email address, askjill@jillonmoney.com. And you can always go to the website, jillonmoney.com. There we have a contact button. Today, Saturday, you might start seeing a bunch of people. Don't forget to wash your hands and wear your masks and maintain your physical distancing, and lift somebody up today if you wouldn't mind. We'll talk to you tomorrow.